At least your sister had the sense to marry someone worth something. My mother said it the way she said everything, quietly, deliberately, making sure the words landed before anyone could catch them in the air and take them back. 32 relatives packed into my aunt's backyard in Oakville, Ontario, paper plates balanced on laps, somebody's kid running through the sprinkler in the side yard. Canada Day long weekend, flags on every porch. My mother chose that moment, that crowd, that particular stillness between songs on the Bluetooth speaker, to look at me across the picnic table and deliver her verdict. I was holding a can of Creamore. I didn't put it down. My brother-in-law laughed first. Not nervous, full permission, the kind that only happens when the person at the top of the room has already swung and everyone else just has to decide which side of the line they're standing on. My cousin laughed next, then my aunt. Then the ripple went through the yard like dominoes, and 32 people who shared my blood and my grandmother's recipes were laughing at the woman in the quiet corner who'd driven 4 hours from Ottawa and hadn't eaten yet. I looked at my mother, past the wine in her hand, past the sun hat she wore to every summer event, past 40 years of her deciding what I was worth before I'd had a chance to prove anything at all. I said one word, Ashwood. Across the yard, near the fence where he'd been standing alone with a Molson in his hand, my old neighbor, 71 years old, retired OPP inspector, 34 years on the force, a man who'd walked into rooms in this province that most people couldn't imagine, went still. Not the stillness of someone startled. The stillness of someone who had just heard a word they recognized from a file they'd spent years trying to forget. His bottle came down on the wooden railing so hard it should have shattered. Stop! His voice came out rough, like a road in spring. Lord Almighty! Ashwood. And then, in front of my mother, in front of the 32 people who had just been laughing, he crossed the yard, stood in front of me, and extended his hand in a slow, deliberate handshake, the kind that means something. The laughter didn't fade. It stopped. Like someone had cut the power. But before I tell you what Ashwood meant, and why a man who had seen everything this province could throw at a person went pale at a single word spoken in a backyard in Oakville, subscribe to this channel, because what happened next was something not one person in that yard was prepared for. His name was Gerald Okafor. He'd lived 3 houses down from us on Maple Ridge Drive for 11 years. My mother had always called him the quiet one on the street. She meant it as a small dismissal, the way she categorized anyone who didn't fill a room with noise. But Gerald Okafor had spent 3 decades doing the kind of quiet work that never makes the newspaper until suddenly, all at once, it does. He set his bottle down properly this time and reached into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt. He pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed and soft at the creases, the kind that's been opened and refolded so many times it started to become fabric. He spread it flat on the picnic table beside me. Then he pulled out another, and another, 7 of them. Everyone stripped of identifying details, standard for ongoing investigations, my name never printed, my face never shown. But Gerald had circled things, dates. A case number that appeared in 3 separate articles, a reference to an intake unit that only existed in one city in one province. A quote from an anonymous source that used a specific phrase I had used in exactly one interview, years earlier, thinking it would never be traced back to me. He'd connected every dot. Every time one of these ran, he said, voice still rough, I cut it out. Because people who do this work never talk about it. And somebody should keep the record. The laughter in the yard had been dead for 30 seconds. It felt longer. 32 people stood in my aunt's garden, knowing less about the woman they'd been laughing at 60 seconds ago than a neighbor they barely spoke to. I said nothing. I picked up my Creamore, took one slow sip, set it back exactly where it had been. My eyes moved around the yard the way they always did in situations I didn't control. Who was looking for an exit? Who was waiting for me to cry so they could call it overreaction? Who was watching my mother for the signal on how to respond? My cousin Marcus had found his phone extremely interesting. My aunt was refilling her wine with great concentration. My brother-in-law, the one my mother had just praised, was staring at the clippings like he was trying to read them upside down from 6 feet away. My mother recovered. She always did. She lowered her voice into the register she used when she was being patient with someone who simply wasn't keeping up. Gerald, I appreciate your loyalty, I do. But Nora has always had a gift for embellishing. Even as a little girl, she made things bigger than they were. A small, sympathetic smile. You know how it is. My sister was beside her in an instant. Brow furrowed, voice soft and careful. Are you okay? You seem really tense. We're just worried about you, Nora. You work so hard and you never let anyone in. That sentence was a precision instrument. It took a handshake from a 34-year veteran of the Ontario Provincial Police and repackaged it as a symptom, not decorated. Overwhelmed, not recognized, fragile. I set my can down, breathed in for 4 counts, held it, out for 4. I stood, walked to Gerald and shook his hand again. Firm, eye level. Thank you for coming, sir. Just loud enough that anyone paying attention would know I wasn't performing surprise. I'd always known who Gerald Okafor was. I'd known for years. He leaned close, voice barely above the noise of the sprinkler still running in the side yard. There's a dinner night! Westin, downtown Toronto, Child Welfare Policy Summit. The keynote speaker is getting a Governor General's commendation. He paused. You know the name. One beat. I nodded once. I didn't go back to the table. I sat in my car in front of my aunt's house. Engine off, windows up, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, long after the last relative had gone inside. The sun was going down over the rooftops. Someone on the next block was still setting off firecrackers, little bursts of color I could see between the houses. I reached across to the back seat for my jacket and my hand brushed a photo album my mother had left on the passenger seat to give me. She'd been collecting family photos for a project. I opened it to the middle. There I was at 14, standing at the edge of every frame. Not because I'd chosen to stand apart, because by the time everyone else arranged themselves around the people they wanted to be close to, that was the space that was left. The memories don't come in order when you sit alone like that. They come in pieces. The year I was accepted into the social work honors program at Carleton, my mother didn't ask for the date of the welcome ceremony. The year my sister got a promotion at her marketing firm, my mother reserved a table at the Keg for 12 people, called every relative, ordered a cake from the Portuguese bakery on King Street that she only ever called for special occasions. The year I mailed home the first mention in a provincial report, anonymous, but there, about the case my unit had quietly worked for 18 months, my mother put the envelope in the recycling without opening it. The year my sister announced her engagement, my mother wept with happiness in a Facebook post that got 64 likes. The caption read, "My heart is so full, not once, not an accident." A system, maintained with the precision of someone who had decided, early on, which daughter had a future worth celebrating and which one needed to be managed. The sharpest memory. I was 16, sitting at the kitchen table in our house in Hamilton, telling my mother I wanted to study criminology and then go into child protection work. She didn't get angry. She got sorry for me. The way you get sorry for someone who's just told you something they genuinely believe, but that you know isn't going to happen. Nora, honey, that kind of work burns people out. It's not sustainable. You need a backup plan, something practical. She poured herself coffee. Your cousin went into HR. Have you thought about something like that? Beside her, my sister was on her phone and didn't look up. She never had to. My mother carried the message. My sister just stood in the same room when it was delivered. That was the first time I understood that it wasn't doubt. It was a decision that had been made before I was old enough to have evidence to the contrary, and it was never going to be revised. I closed the album, put it on the back seat, didn't throw it away, the way you keep things you might need later. I thought about something I'd written in the margin of a textbook in my second year at Carleton. A line from a social work professor whose name I've since forgotten, but whose words I've kept. The work is not the reward. The work is the condition under which the reward becomes possible. 19 years I'd lived that sentence. Every case, every file, every kid I'd helped pull out of a situation they couldn't name yet, that was my answer. It didn't need an audience. But this time, after that word had left my mouth in my aunt's backyard, and Gerald had whispered about Tuesday, something had changed around me. Not in me, around me. The truth was not going to wait another decade. I knew the name he'd mentioned. Of course I did. The Ashwood case had been the reason I'd said that word out loud in the first place. Winter, 8 years ago. February in Ottawa, which means a cold that doesn't argue with you. It just settles in and stays. We had a file on a group home operator. Complaints going back 3 years, 11 children in a facility that was licensed for 8. Heating that failed 3 times a winter and got repaired each time just long enough to pass the next inspection. A pattern of incident reports that disappeared before they reached provincial review. The operator's name was on a shortlist for a government recognition award. He had photographs with 2 different cabinet ministers. He sat on the advisory board of the very organization that was supposed to be overseeing facilities like his. My supervisor told me directly, the file was being transferred, broacher scope, higher jurisdiction, walk away and let the process work. The process had been working for 3 years, and 11 children were still in that building. I kept the file open. I didn't go to the press. I didn't go around my supervisor. I went up, methodically, carefully, with documentation that took me 4 months to assemble, to a senior director in the ministry who I had never met but whose name appeared in every internal memo as the person ultimately responsible for residential oversight. I walked into her office with a binder, a timeline, and a case number, and I laid it out with the same tone I used for every presentation I'd ever given. Flat, factual, evidenced. She read the whole thing. Didn't speak for 2 full minutes after I finished. Then she said, "How long did it take you to build this?" 4 months of evenings. She closed the binder. "Leave it with me." What happened next took another 7 months and involved people with considerably more authority than either of us. The facility was closed. the operator lost his license and faced a regulatory review that eventually led to charges. The children were placed, not perfectly. Placement is never perfect, but somewhere better, somewhere warmer, somewhere with incident reports that actually reached the desk they were supposed to reach. My name appeared in no public document. Standard operating procedure. Child protection work in this country runs on anonymity because the alternative is that workers become targets, and the cases suffer. But Gerald Okafor had read 7 newspaper articles over 4 years that mentioned the Ashwood case in passing. A facility name, a timeline, a phrase, and he had cut every one of them out and kept them because he recognized the shape of a person who didn't brag, and he wanted someone to have the record. I sat in my car outside my aunt's house until the firecrackers stopped and the street went quiet. Then I called the one person who'd held the line when everything else collapsed. She picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. Her name was Marianne Duchesne, Director of Residential Oversight, Ministry of Children and Families, Province of Ontario. The woman who had read my binder, closed it, said leave it with me, and meant it. "Ashwood," I said. "I know." A pause. "The keynote Tuesday. I'll be there." I was reaching for my keys when my mother appeared from the side of the house. She moved the way she always moved when she needed to reset a conversations. Purposeful, carrying something, making the gesture do the work the words couldn't. She was holding a plate of squares wrapped in plastic wrap, Nanaimo bars. She only ever made them for my sister's birthday. Every year since I was 9, I had watched my mother pull that recipe card out of the tin box on the 3rd shelf and make exactly that. Not for Christmas. Not for Easter. For my sister's birthday. "I didn't want you to leave without taking some," she said. Her voice had completely changed. The sharp edges were gone, replaced with the soft, worried register she could activate with the speed of someone flipping a light switch. "Have you eaten tonight? You drove all the way from Ottawa." I looked at the plate. "I'm fine," I said. She didn't leave. Leaving would mean accepting that the food hadn't worked. "Gerald means well," she said, dropping into the instructional tone she used for things she considered settled, "but he's been retired for years. These old men, they get attached to stories. I'm sure whatever he's remembering, it was real to him. I'm not saying, I just think sometimes the details get bigger with time, you know?" My sister materialized from behind her, phone in hand, eyes not on the screen. "Seriously, are you okay? Because you've been really closed off tonight. We're trying to reach out and you just..." She paused, making her face do the work. "We love you, Nora. We just don't understand why you make everything so hard." There it was. Clean as a scalpel. Not, "Gerald was wrong, too risky." Instead, "You are unwell, you are difficult. Your response to being publicly humiliated is evidence of your instability." I looked at my sister for a moment, long enough that she shifted her weight. "Mum," I placed my hand flat on the car door, kept my voice even. "I'm not going to do this tonight, not because I don't have things to say. Because what I need to say isn't for this driveway." My mother opened her mouth. "Gerald doesn't misremember things," I said before the first word formed. "And I'm not closed off. I'm just done performing openness for people who use it as a way in." I got in the car, started the engine, didn't check the rearview mirror. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Tuesday, Toronto. A man who had built his career on the file I'd spent 4 months of evenings assembling was about to stand on a stage and receive a commendation funded in part by the very ministry he had once manipulated. And I was going to be in the room. I've driven the 401 between Ottawa and Toronto more times than I can count. There's a stretch east of Kingston where the highway opens up and the lake appears on the south side, and on a clear morning, it looks like the edge of the world. I always notice it. I always notice it the same way. I pulled over once, somewhere past Napanee, not because I needed to, but because the weight of what I was carrying needed a minute to be still. I thought about my mother sitting in her house in Hamilton, probably asleep by then, in the bedroom with the photographs of my sister's wedding on the dresser and the photograph of my university graduation in the hall closet. Not on the dresser, in the closet. I'm not sure she knows I know that. I thought about whether she believed what she said in that backyard, not the cruelty of it, the belief behind it. Whether she had genuinely, for 40 years, looked at her younger daughter and seen someone small, or whether the smallness was something she needed me to stay, so that the comparison always came out the same way. I decided that question was one I had already spent too many years on. I started the engine. One phone call I hadn't been prepared for came 3 days before the dinner, while I was still in Ottawa packing a bag. It was my ex-husband. Not to say he'd read the news and been thinking about me. Not to check in. He wanted to know if I'd be in Toronto that week, because he needed me to sign something related to the sale of our old condo downtown. And his lawyer preferred wet signatures. He mentioned in the same phone call that he'd seen a reference to the Ashwood case in a legal newsletter and asked if I was involved. When I said yes, he said, "I just don't want this to become a whole thing again. You know how these high-profile cases can follow people around." He meant follow him around. He'd said as much when everything first came out, Not the case itself, but the whispers about it. The fact that my name was in rooms where difficult conversations were happening. He found the proximity professionally inconvenient. We'd been separated for 6 months by then. That phone call was the reason I stopped wondering if we'd made the right decision. The person who held the line wasn't him. It was Marianne Duchesne, who had taken my binder home over a long weekend in February and read it twice, and who had then spent 7 months, patient, unglamorous, career-wrecking work of navigating a political landmine without losing the case. She never told me what that cost her internally. I only found out later, from someone who'd been in the room when she presented to the deputy minister, that she had put her own name on every document. She could have buried mine further, and she didn't. She kept me in the file. She'd called me, 8 months after it was over, to tell me, not to receive thanks, just to tell me so I'd know. I didn't sleep the night before the dinner. Not from nerves. I'd stopped being nervous about rooms full of important people somewhere around year 10 of this work. I lay in the hotel room on King Street and thought about the 17-year-old girl in our file whose name I'd never spoken in public. The one who had eventually come forward to a school counselor and whose account had given our case the corroboration it needed. She didn't know what her words had done. She was probably in college now. I hoped she was in college. I got up at 5, pressed my blazer, the one I wore to depositions and ministry meetings, charcoal, good cut, the kind that reads serious without needing to announce itself. I looked in the mirror, and the face looking back wasn't younger, but it was clearer than it had been about what it was doing here. The Westin Ballroom was doing what ballrooms do. Chandelier light, round tables in white linen, the hum of people who move comfortably in rooms like this. The kind of event where the wine is poured before you sit down, and the program is printed on cardstock. Gerald was already there when I arrived, standing near the registration table, wearing his good jacket. He gave me a nod when he saw the blazer and didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say. The man being honored that evening, I'll call him what the program called him, the operator, was across the room when I walked in. Silver-haired, easy in his body, surrounded by the specific comfort of someone who had been celebrated so many times that he had begun to mistake the celebration for the truth. He saw me from across the room. The smile didn't disappear. It recalculated. I watched him register the blazer, the posture, the fact that I was moving through his space without hesitation. Then he registered who I was. The file he'd thought was closed. The name that had never appeared in a newspaper but had apparently appeared in every internal conversation that mattered. I sat at an unreserved table near the center of the room, both hands flat on the linen, waiting. He came to me before the program started. He couldn't leave me there without attempting to manage it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, wrong name, which was either a genuine mistake or a deliberate diminishment, and I knew which. Extending his hand with the warm confidence of a man who'd been shaking hands in rooms like this for 20 years. "Wonderful to see you supporting the sector." I let the silence go for 3 full seconds. "It's Ashford, and I'm not here to support the sector." I kept my voice level. "I'm here as a witness." He lowered his hand. The warmth didn't exactly leave his face. It went somewhere else and waited. He walked back toward the head table, but his shoulders were wrong, too high, too deliberate. He'd just shown me he was scared, and he'd done it in a room full of people who knew what scared looked like on a professional. Gerald settled into the chair beside mine, voice low. "Your mother and sister are at the far side of the room near the bar." I'd seen them the moment I walked in. I nodded once. "Good," he said. "They should see this." The program opened the way these programs always open. Soft music, remarks from a board chair, a land acknowledgement read from a card. Then the MC began the introduction of the keynote honoree, transformative leadership, steadfast commitment to the children in our care, recognition from the Governor General's office. Every word a small violence against the children in that house in February who'd worn coats indoors. I placed both palms flat on the table. He took the podium. The ease was practiced and real at the same time, the specific ease of someone who has been told he's exceptional so many times that he's stopped questioning it. He opened with a story about his first group home, a troubled youth who turned his life around, the kind of story that gets told at fundraising dinners because it puts a face on an abstraction. The audience nodded. Applause at the pauses. I didn't clap, spine straight, eyes on him, completely still. He felt it. I could see it in the way he gripped the podium a degree tighter each time his gaze crossed my table. Then he made his mistake. "In this sector," he said, voice shifting into the register of a man sharing hard truths, "we sometimes encounter individuals who, despite good intentions, lack the emotional regulation necessary for effective advocacy. Zeal without judgment creates collateral damage. Those of us with the experience to know the difference, we have a responsibility to protect the integrity of this work from those who would sensationalize it." He looked directly at my table. Gerald was on his feet before I had finished drawing breath. He didn't move fast. He moved with the certainty of someone who has made this kind of decision before and knows exactly what it costs and pays it anyway. I was there. No microphone, didn't need one. His voice had the quality of a man who delivered hard news in kitchens and hospital waiting rooms for 3 decades, trained to carry across a room without rising to a shout. Every head turned. I spent 34 years with the Ontario Provincial Police, Gerald said. I've read the Ashwood file. I've read the oversight reports. I've read the 7 years of inspection records that showed heating failures and overcapacity and complaint forms that never made it past the first desk. He extended his arm across the room, pointing at me, steady. This woman built the case that closed that facility. She did it on her own time after hours because the system she worked in told her to walk away. She didn't walk away. The murmur in the room was not quiet. The operator's forehead was damp. His knuckles on the podium had gone pale. The first domino fell. A woman near the back, mid-50s, blazer with a regional health authority lanyard, pushed back her chair and stood. Her voice was careful and even. I worked intake in the Ashwood catchment area. 3 of the children from that facility came through my office after the closure. The documentation we received told a very different story than the one I just heard from that podium. A retired children's aid supervisor stood from the middle of the room. I submitted a complaint to the provincial registry in 2017. I was told the file had been escalated and would be reviewed. I never received a follow-up. A man near the front, gray-haired, holding a program he'd folded in half and was now slowly folding again, stood without looking at anyone in particular. His voice was quiet and completely controlled. My granddaughter was in a facility this man co-directed in 2016. She is doing well. She is doing well because a worker I never met refused to close a file she'd been asked to close. He paused. I've spent 6 years trying to find out who that worker was. Now I know. Then a young woman stood from a table near the center. She was maybe 24, 25, good posture. She wasn't wearing a lanyard or a badge. She just stood and looked at me and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, I was 16. I talked to a school counselor in February 2016 because I didn't know who else to talk to. They told me later that my statement had mattered. Her voice was steady. I'm in my 2nd year of social work at U of T. I'm here because I was on the invitation list for emerging sector leaders. She paused. I didn't know you'd be here. I'm glad you are. I sat very still. Marianne Duchesne rose from the front row, unhurried. The deliberate movement of someone who has been in rooms like this for 25 years and understands exactly when the moment has arrived. The room went silent in a different way when people recognized her. The Ashwood Oversight Review was partially declassified by the ministry last spring, she said. Her voice needed no amplification. The internal investigation files, including the original complaint documentation, the escalation record, and the correspondence that preceded the facility closure, are now part of the public record. The historical account has been corrected. She looked at the man at the podium for exactly 2 seconds. He had nothing left. From near the back, the woman with the health authority lanyard raised her hand to her brow, a small, precise gesture. The retired supervisor did the same, then Gerald, then slowly the grandfather with the folded program. The young woman from U of T raised her hand last. I stood, heels together, hand raised. My mother was visible from where I stood. She was against the far wall near the bar, and she had one hand pressed flat against her sternum, and her face was doing something I had never seen it do in 40 years. My sister was beside her, phone in her hand but the screen dark, her expression emptied of every expression she'd practiced. I didn't look away from them. I didn't look toward them either. I just let them be in the room. 3 days later, my doorbell rang at 9:30 in the morning. I looked through the peephole. My mother was standing on my front step in Hamilton. She'd driven an hour and a half, no sun hat, no wine. Plain clothes, her gray hair down instead of set. She was holding a tin of Nanaimo bars, not the fancy ceramic plate from Canada Day, the actual tin they came in, the old one with the dent in the corner that had lived in her cupboard since I was a child. I stood on the inside of the door for a moment. 4 counts, 4 holds, 4 out. I opened the door, didn't step back, didn't say come in. Nora. Her voice broke before she got to the second syllable. I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I looked at my mother, not in the way I'd looked at her at the barbecue, across a picnic table, with 32 people between us. Up close, her face without the performance. You didn't understand, I said, keeping my voice quiet and even or you didn't try to. She opened her mouth. I called you from Ottawa in 2016, I said. After the facility closed, I called you because it had been a hard year, and I needed to tell someone what I'd done. You asked me if I'd found a more stable position yet. Then you told me your sister's daughter had just made junior partner at her firm in Mississauga. I paused. You didn't ask about my work once in that conversation, or in the 3 after it. Her eyes were filling. Mum, I kept going, not because I needed her to hurt, but because this was the first time I had ever said any of it out loud to her face, and I was not going to stop halfway. You had my number every year. Every city I transferred to, I made sure you had the number. You chose not to call it, she cried. Not the composed, careful crying she did at funerals, the other kind. The kind that means something has broken that was under pressure for a long time. Give me a chance, she said. Please. I looked at the tin in her hands. You don't need a chance to understand me, I said, and my voice was gentler than I expected it to be. You need a chance to feel better about this. Those are two different things, and I'm not the right person to give you the second one. She tried to say something else. I waited until I was sure she'd finished. Go home, Mum. Take care of yourself. I closed the door, the deadbolt, clean and final. My sister texted 11 minutes later. I know because I was still standing in the hallway when it came through. She's really upset. Can you call her? You don't have to agree with her, you just have to be kinder about it. Not one question about the Ashwood case. Not one sentence about the file, the facility, the 16-year-old who'd talked to a school counselor, the children in the building with the broken heating. Not one word about the 8 years I'd spent carrying something alone because the person who was supposed to be in my corner had told me, at 16, to go into HR. Just, could you be less inconvenient? I put my phone face down on the counter. That was the last answer I needed. The following week, the operator called and asked to meet. He chose a Tim Hortons on a highway off-ramp outside the city, his choice, which told me everything about where he thought we were in the conversation. Booth in the back, medium double-double, a man who had arrived without his assistant, without his board chair, without anyone. Just a 63-year-old man, in a regular jacket, looking at the woman he'd spent 8 years trying to make irrelevant. He admitted everything, voice flat and methodical, like a man emptying a storage unit he'd been renting for too long. The complaint suppression, the inspection timing, the political relationships he'd used to redirect the provincial review. The year he'd arranged for the oversight file to be transferred to a jurisdiction he knew was under-resourced. He laid all of it out on the Formica table, not because he'd found a conscience, but because he'd calculated that the weight of carrying it was now greater than the risk of putting it down. When he finished, he asked the question he'd come for. Why didn't you take it to the press? You could have. When the file was transferred, you had enough. I looked at him across the table. Because I needed it to hold, I said. A leak would have let you reframe it. A documented escalation chain with a ministry director's name on every page, that doesn't get reframed. It gets reviewed. I let that land. I also didn't do this for the story. I did it because 11 children were cold. He looked down at his coffee. You'll carry what happened in that facility, I said, not unkindly. You'll carry it in every room where someone knows your name. That's not something I imposed on you. That's just what happens when what you did becomes part of the record. I put a $5 bill on the table for the tea I hadn't touched. Stood up, walked out into the flat gray light of a Tuesday morning in Ontario. 2 weeks after the dinner in Toronto, Gerald called. Not about the operator, not about my mother. There's a group, he said. Meets Thursday evenings, St. Andrew's United on King Street, Hamilton. Social workers, foster coordinators, a couple of retired CAS workers, coffee from a machine that costs 50 cents and sounds like it's about to give out every time. You wanna come? I drove out in jeans and a fleece. No blazer. The room was a church basement. The specific smell of church basements everywhere, old wood and weak coffee, and something slightly sweet that you can never identify. 12 or 13 chairs in a loose circle. A folding table, with a box of Timbits and a thermos someone had brought from home. I took a chair near the wall. I hadn't planned to say anything. I came because Gerald had asked, and that was reason enough. When the facilitator turned to me, I almost declined. Then I looked across the circle and saw a woman, maybe 27, sitting with her elbows on her knees, eyes down, holding her coffee cup with both hands around the middle the way you hold something when you need the warmth more than the coffee. Her shoulders were in. She was trying to take up less space. I recognized her without knowing her name. I'd been her for years. I spoke slowly. Not the ministry meeting voice, not the voice I used with supervisors or directors, the other one. The hardest part of this work, I said, isn't the files. It's going home afterward and sitting with what you couldn't fix yet. And the worst mistake I made in my first few years was believing that if I just worked harder, stayed later, built a better binder, I'd eventually close the gap. You don't close the gap. You just get better at carrying your portion of it without letting it take you under. I paused. And you find people who are carrying it too. That part matters more than anyone tells you in school. The young woman across the circle lifted her eyes. I've heard your name, she said. Her voice was thin. From the Ashwood case. They mentioned it at the faculty seminar. She looked down again, then back up. How do you keep going when the thing you're working on gets transferred and you're told it's not your problem anymore? I thought about February in Ottawa, the file on my kitchen table, the months of evenings, the binder I'd walked into Marianne Duchesne's office with. You decide whose problem it is, I said. And then you find the person in the room with the most authority and the least to lose, and you put it in front of them and you trust them to do something with it. I paused. And if you can't find that person, you keep looking until you do, because that person exists, I promise you. The woman nodded, small, something shifting behind her eyes. Around the circle, the older workers were quiet. The nod of people who'd been carrying the same question alone for a long time and had just heard it spoken out loud by someone else. I drove home after midnight on the 403, window cracked, the particular smell of a southern Ontario summer, cut grass and something industrial at the edge of it, the lake somewhere off to the south, no radio. I thought about my mother in her house in Hamilton, with the family photographs arranged the way they'd always been arranged. My sister's wedding portrait in the living room, my graduation photo in the hall closet. I wondered if she'd moved it yet. I decided it didn't matter. I thought about the operator in his house somewhere, carrying the weight of what he'd done now that he'd put it down in a Tim Hortons booth. I thought about my ex-husband, wherever he was, still managing proximity to difficult things. I thought about my sister probably composing a text to someone about how hard the family situation was and how she was really trying. All of them locked in the particular hell of a story that had gone on too long without correction. The hell of small decisions accumulated into a shape too large to walk back from. The hell of choosing the easier version of events so many times that the true version began to feel like someone else's problem. But not me. I had walked into every version of cold. The file nobody wanted. The escalation everyone had been avoiding. The meeting where I was the only person in the room without political protection. The driveway where my mother held out Nanaimo bars and hoped it would be enough. I had carried myself through all of it. Not because someone showed up to carry me, but because I kept deciding, one winter at a time, that the work in front of me was more important than the wound behind me. The highway opened up past Ancaster. The dark, flat land of the Niagara Escarpment on one side, the orange glow of Hamilton on the other. I thought about the young woman in the church basement, the one with her elbows on her knees. I thought about the 17-year-old who had walked into a school counselor's office in February and said the words that changed everything, who was now in second-year social work at the University of Toronto, standing in a ballroom full of people who finally knew what her courage had cost her and what it had made possible. I thought about Marianne Duchesne, who had put her own name on every document, who had called me 8 months after it was over just to make sure I knew. I thought about Gerald, cutting out newspaper articles in his living room in Oakville for 7 years, putting them in a chest pocket, waiting for the right moment to hand them back. The quiet inside the car wasn't loneliness. It was the other thing. The silence that comes when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you're finally near enough to put it down. I had stood at the edge of every family photograph I'd ever been in, not because I chose to, but because that was the space that was left. For 40 years, I had been the daughter who was endured, the worker who was redirected, the woman who was told to be quieter, less, more convenient. I had been Ashwood, not a code name for a case. A code name for the part of you that keeps the file open when everyone else has already marked it closed. That part doesn't retire. It just finally learns that it doesn't have to work alone.